Hello and welcome to Geopolitics, the long game, power, money, and the world they don't want you to know about. Season 1, Episode 1. What is geopolitics? Well, in 1904, a British geographer stood up in front of the Royal Geographical Society in London, I believe in Curzon Street at the time, and made a prediction. He said that whomever controls the great landmass of Eurasia, the vast interior of the continent, stretching from Eastern Europe to China, would eventually control the world. His name was Halford Mackinder. He called it the Heartland. The two world wars that followed, the Cold War, NATO's eastward expansion, the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Ukraine, Iran, the rising tension over Taiwan, all of it, every bit of it, can be traced back to a competition over that same geography. The map doesn't lie, it never has. And once you learn to read it the way the people in power read it, you cannot unsee it. Welcome to the long game. I'm Richard, your host, and today we learn to see the board. So, what is geopolitics? We hear the word everywhere nowadays. News anchors use it, politicians invoke it. But most of the time it functions as a kind of intellectual shorthand for complicated stuff happening abroad. That's not what it means. Geopolitics, at its core, is the study of how geography shapes political power, how the physical features of the world, the mountains, the rivers, coastlines, resources, even distance, determine what nations can do, what they must do, and what they can never escape from doing. The word was coined in 1899 by a Swedish political scientist named Rudolf Scheelen. But the idea is ancient. You can find it in Sun Tzu, the now famous Thucydides, in the strategic calculations of every empire that has ever tried to expand and hold territory. The core insight is simple but profound. States don't have personalities. They don't have feelings. They have geography. And geography creates interests that persists across centuries, regardless of who's in power, what ideology governs them, or what they say in public. Russia, for example, has always needed a warm water port. Britain has always needed to prevent any single power from dominating continental Europe. The United States has always feared a rival that could consolidate Eurasia. These aren't preferences. They are structural necessities. When you understand that, the headlines now start to look slightly different. The first great debate in geopolitical theory is one that still drives strategy today: land power versus sea power. In 1890, an American naval officer named Alfred Mahan published a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. His argument was pretty straightforward. Nations that control the seas control global trade, and nations that control global trade control the world. Britain understood this intuitively. At its height, the Royal Navy didn't just protect British shores. It was the enforcement mechanism for a global commercial empire. The ability to project power across oceans, to blockade enemies, to protect shipping lanes. That was a source of British dominance. Mahan's work was read obsessively by Roosevelt, by the German Kaiser, by the Japanese Admiralty. Every major naval buildup of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was in part a response to his ideas. But Halford Mackinder disagreed. His counter-argument made in that 1904 lecture was that the age of sea power was ending. Railways and modern logistics were now allowing land powers to move armies and resources across vast continents at speeds that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. The interior of Eurasia, previously inaccessible and ungovernable, was becoming the key strategic prize. His formula became famous. Who rules East Europe commands the Heartland. Who rules the Heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world. Now, you might think that this is abstract theory, but Napoleon drove east. Germany in both world wars drove east. The Cold War was fundamentally a contest to prevent Soviet domination of Eurasia. And NATO's most urgent current concern, what it has been since 1991, is who controls Eastern Europe. The theory is over a century old. The policy it generates is today's front page. Here's a question worth asking. If geopolitical analysis is this powerful, if it genuinely explains the deep logic of world events, why isn't it taught in schools? Why isn't it the framework that political journalists reach for first? Well, part of the answer is that geopolitics properly applied is deeply inconvenient. It strips away the language of values, democracy promotion, humanitarian intervention, and rules-based order, and replaces it with a colder, harder set of questions. Who benefits? Who controls the resources? What geography is being contested? Whose sphere of influence is this really about? John Mearsheimer, one of the most important living international relations theorists, has spent decades arguing that great powers behave according to structural logic, not moral preference. That the United States expanded NATO not because it loves democracy, but because it cannot tolerate a peer competitor on the Eurasian landmass. That Russia's reaction to NATO's expansion wasn't irrational aggression. It was the predictable response of any major power to an alliance moving to its doorstep. Mearsheimer has been vilified for it, called an apologist, a Putin sympathizer. But his framework was laid out in 1990, 2014, and in detail before the 2022 Ukrainian war. And events have tracked his predictions with uncomfortable precision. Now that's what good geopolitical analysis does. It's not about taking sides. It's about understanding the forces that make certain outcomes almost inevitable, regardless of who we want to win. Alex Krainer, a former hedge fund manager who grew up in Yugoslavia and made his career in Western finance, puts it this way: the map of interests is always more reliable than the map of stated intentions. Watch what states do, not what they say. Follow the geography, follow the money. The truth is almost always there. And that, in essence, is what this podcast is going to do. Over the next podcasts, we're going to learn to read the board, dimension by dimension, move by move, until a full game is visible. This first season is about building your toolkit. We'll work through the fundamental concepts, Heartland theory, Rimland theory, the logic of empire, what a world order actually is and how it's enforced. By the end of 8 episodes, you'll have a framework that makes sense of almost any geopolitical event you will encounter. Season 2 goes historical. We trace the arc from the First World War, which wasn't really about an archduke, as we'll discover, through Bretton Woods, the Cold War, the construction of the American-led world order that has governed global affairs since 1945. Carol Quigley's great work, Tragedy and Hope of the Western World, will be our guide. Season 3 follows the money, the City of London, Wall Street, the robber barons, the gold standard and its abandonment, the petrodollar system, which is the linchpin of American global power and which is now under serious sustained challenge for the first time in 50 years. Season 4 looks at the resistance, Russia, China, now Iran, not as cartoon villains, but as states with their own geopolitical logic, having their own historical wounds, and their own strategies for surviving in a US-dominated order. And Season 5 goes to the darkest place of all, the people. The psychology of those who reach the apex of power, what they share, what drives them, what they are willing to do, and how the system itself may select for exactly the kind of personality the rest of us should fear the most. It's a long journey, but every episode is 10 minutes to 15 minutes. And I promise you this, by the end, you will never read a newspaper again or watch the news in the same way. Every episode ends with the notation, one recorded move in the long game, where the strategy became briefly and undeniably visible. A declassified document, a leaked memo, a sequence of events that reveals the true nature of the move being made. In today's notation, it happened in 1997. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former US National Security Advisor and one of the architects of American Cold War strategy, published a book called The Grand Chessboard. In it, he writes without apology that the chief geopolitical goal of the United States must be to prevent any single Eurasian power from gaining control of the continent. He specifically identifies Ukraine as the pivotal state. He writes, and I'm paraphrasing, that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire. Now, this was not a secret document. It was in fact a bestseller. Brzezinski was explaining, in plain language, the logic that would drive 25 years of US policy, including NATO expansion, the 2014 Maidan events, and what we are living through today. In episode 2, The Heartland and the Rimland, we go deeper into Mackinder's model. And then we put it against the map of today's world. We look at NATO's eastern flank, China's Belt and Road Initiative, the South China Sea. You'll see immediately why the people drawing those maps have Mackinder on their shelves. Now, if this episode made you think, please share it, comment, subscribe. Not for the numbers, but because the more people who understand this framework, the harder it becomes to sell them a war on false pretenses. I'm Richard, this is The Long Game, and next week we read the board's geography and find out why one map drawn in 1904 still determines every major strategic decision being made today.